Most empaths never fail because they lack depth. They fail because they never move beyond survival. And that distinction matters more than people realize. If you look closely at the early life pattern of most empaths, you'll notice something consistent. They learned very early how to read a room, not as a skill for influence, but as a necessity for safety. They became hyper aware of tone shifts, facial expressions, emotional undercurrents, not because they wanted to master people, but because at some point it was the only way to maintain stability in their environment. So, what develops is not just empathy, it's adaptation, a highly refined, almost automatic system of emotional monitoring and response. They anticipate needs, diffuse tension, and shape shift their behavior to maintain harmony. On the surface, this looks like kindness, sensitivity, even emotional intelligence. But underneath it, there's a more primitive driver, survival. And survival mode is a very specific characteristic. It prioritizes short term stability over long term evolution. This is where the trap forms because once an empath becomes effective at managing emotional environments, they start to receive reinforcement. People rely on them. They're seen as the strong one, the understanding one, the one who can handle it. And slowly, without realizing it, they build an identity around being the stabilizer. But here's the problem: that identity is built entirely within the context of other people's needs. So instead of asking, who am I becoming? They stay focused on, what does this situation require from me? And those are two very different questions. The Sophia stage, the stage of clarity, sovereignty, and internal alignment, demands a shift away from external orientation. It requires an individual to stop organizing their life around managing others and start organizing it around truth. Not comfort, not approval, truth. But truth is disruptive. Truth doesn't maintain the existing emotional structure, it challenges it. It forces the empath to see where they've been overextending, where they've been tolerating, where they've been abandoning themselves in subtle, socially acceptable ways. And this is where most empaths hesitate because stepping out of survival mode doesn't feel like relief at first, it feels like risk. When you've spent years preventing conflict, choosing yourself feels like creating conflict. When you've built your identity on being needed, stepping back feels like losing value. When you've trained yourself to maintain emotional equilibrium, disrupting that system feels like instability. So even when they become aware, intellectually aware that something needs to change, they often don't act. They stay in the loop, managing, adjusting, absorbing, not because they're weak, but because the system they've built has worked, at least in terms of keeping things together. But keeping things together is not the same as growth. Growth requires tension. It requires the willingness to let certain dynamics break so something more aligned can take their place. And for an empath condition to prevent breakdowns, this is deeply counterintuitive. So they remain in a state of functional exhaustion. They're aware enough to feel the misalignment, but conditioned enough to maintain it. And over time, this creates a quiet form of stagnation, not obvious from the outside because they still appear composed, capable, even wise. But internally, there's no real movement, no expansion, just repetition. The same patterns with different people, the same emotional labor in different environments, the same quiet question that never fully gets answered. When does it become about me? Reaching the Sophia stage means confronting that question directly and being willing to accept the implications of the answer. It means recognizing that survival is not the end goal, it was the starting point. And at some stage, continuing to operate from survival is no longer protection, it's limitation. Because the very skills that once kept you safe can become the mechanisms that keep you stuck. Reading everyone else, but not expressing yourself. Maintaining peace, but not experiencing it internally. Being indispensable to others, but disconnected from your own direction. So the transition out of this phase isn't about losing empathy. It's about redefining its role. It's about shifting from unconscious reaction to conscious choice. From managing emotions to understanding them without absorbing them. From being shaped by the environment to choosing how you engage with it. And that shift requires something most empaths aren't initially comfortable with: disengagement, not as avoidance, but as strategy. The willingness to step back, to observe without intervening, to let situations unfold without immediately stabilizing them. That's where clarity begins. That's where identity separates from function. Because as long as you are constantly responding, you never get the distance required to see. And without seeing, there is no evolution. So the real question isn't whether an empath has the capacity to reach the Sophia stage. They do. The question is whether they're willing to leave behind the version of themselves that was built for survival and step into a version that is built for truth, even if it disrupts everything that once felt stable. Because at some point, staying the same is no longer safe. It's just familiar. If survival mode is the foundation, then the absence of boundaries is what keeps that structure permanently intact. Because without boundaries, there is no separation. And without separation, there is no identity. An empath who cannot define where they end and someone else begins will always be operating in a state of diffusion, not direction. What most people misunderstand about boundaries is that they see them as a social tool, something you use to manage other people's behavior. But at a deeper level, boundaries are a psychological structure. They define your limits, your standards, your capacity, and most importantly, your sense of self. Without them, you don't just lose energy, you lose clarity. And empaths, by their very nature, are vulnerable to this loss because their default orientation is outward. They feel first, interpret second, and prioritize response over reflection. So when someone expresses a need, an emotion, or even subtle discomfort, the empath instinctively moves toward it. They engage, they accommodate, they adjust. Not because they've consciously decided to, but because it feels automatic. And over time, this creates a pattern of overextension. They say yes when they mean maybe. They tolerate when they should question. They remain present in spaces that are quietly depleting them simply because leaving would feel like disruption. And every one of these small decisions accumulates into something much larger, a life that is shaped more by external demand than internal intention. Now, here's where it becomes critical. Every time an empath overrides their own limit, they send a signal not just to others, but to themselves. The signal is this: my boundary is negotiable. And the more that signal is repeated, the weaker the boundary becomes, until eventually it's no longer a boundary at all. It's just a preference that gets ignored. And this is why so many empaths feel exhausted without understanding why. It's not just that they're giving too much, it's that they've lost the internal mechanism that tells them when to stop. The Sophia stage requires a fundamentally different relationship with energy. It requires discipline, not emotional suppression, but emotional regulation. The ability to feel without immediately reacting, the ability to recognize a demand without automatically meeting it, and most importantly, the ability to tolerate the discomfort that comes with saying no, because that discomfort is real. When an empath begins to establish boundaries, the first response is not relief. It's tension. There's guilt. There's second guessing. There's a sense that they're somehow doing something wrong by not being as available, as accommodating, as responsive as they used to be. But that reaction isn't a sign that the boundary is incorrect. It's a sign that it's new. You're interrupting a pattern that has likely been in place for years, and any interruption creates friction. What makes this even more complex is that the external environment often resists the change as well. People who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries may push back subtly or directly. They may question, criticize, or attempt to reestablish the old dynamic, not necessarily out of malice, but out of familiarity. And this is where most empaths falter. They interpret that resistance as a signal to retreat. They take it as evidence that the boundary is damaging the relationship rather than revealing its true nature. So they revert. They soften the limits. They reopen the door they were trying to close. And in doing so, they reinforce the very pattern they were trying to break. But the truth is, a boundary doesn't damage a healthy relationship. It defines it. It creates clarity. It establishes mutual respect. And if a relationship cannot sustain that clarity, then what it was built on was not alignment, but access. And access is not the same as connection. The empath who reaches the Sophia stage understands this distinction. They no longer measure the value of a relationship by how much they can give, but by how well it aligns with who they are becoming. And that shift changes everything because now energy is no longer distributed by default. It's directed with intention. They begin to recognize that not every emotion requires their involvement. Not every problem requires their solution. Not every person requires their presence. And this recognition is not cold, it's precise. It allows them to engage more deeply where it matters, instead of being spread thin across everything. And with that precision comes restoration. Energy returns. Focus sharpens. Identity solidifies. Because for the first time, they are no longer reacting to the environment, they are choosing their place within it. But this only happens when boundaries move from concept to action. It's one thing to understand that you need limits. It's another to enforce them consistently, especially when it feels uncomfortable, especially when it challenges your identity, especially when it risks disappointing others. That's the threshold. And crossing that threshold is what separates awareness from transformation. Because the reality is simple, you cannot evolve while continuously abandoning yourself. At some point, the empath has to decide that preserving their energy is not selfish. It's necessary. That saying no is not rejection, it's definition. And that protecting their internal state is not a withdrawal from the world, but a more intentional way of engaging with it. Because without boundaries, empathy becomes erosion, and with boundaries, it becomes power. So the question isn't whether you care too much, it's whether you're finally willing to care enough about yourself to decide where that care belongs. If you follow the pattern far enough, you begin to see that the issue isn't just survival and it isn't just boundaries, it's identity. And for many empaths, that identity becomes quietly entangled with one core idea: I am valuable because I am needed. Dot. Now, on the surface, that sounds admirable. It looks like generosity, loyalty, compassion. It sounds like purpose. But when you examine it closely, there's a subtle dependency built into that belief. Because if your value is tied to being needed, then your sense of worth is no longer self generated, it's externally assigned. And that creates a hidden vulnerability because now your stability depends on someone else having a problem. Think about that for a moment. If no one needs you, where does that leave you? If no one is leaning on you, seeking your advice, relying on your emotional support, what fills that space? For many empaths, that question is uncomfortable because it exposes something they've spent years avoiding: the absence of a self that exists independently of service. So, what happens is they unconsciously seek out environments where they can maintain that identity. They gravitate toward people who are struggling, situations that are unstable, dynamics that require constant emotional input. Not because they consciously want difficulty, but because it reinforces who they believe they are: the helper, the fixer, the one who holds everything together. But this creates a paradox because in order to maintain that identity, the empath must remain in proximity to dysfunction. And that proximity comes at a cost. It keeps them engaged in cycles where their energy is continuously directed outward, where their growth is secondary to someone else's stability, where their role is defined not by who they are becoming, but by what they are providing. Over time, this becomes more than a pattern, it becomes a dependency, not on a specific person, but on the feeling of being needed. And like any dependency, it shapes behavior. They overinvest, they overcommit, they stay longer than they should, they give more than is sustainable, and they justify it often unconsciously because it aligns with their identity. I'm just someone who cares deeply. This is who I am. This is what I do. But here's the deeper truth. When your identity is built on being needed, you lose the ability to evaluate whether that need is healthy, appropriate, or even real. You stop asking, is this aligned with me? And start asking, how can I maintain my role here? And that question keeps you stuck because the SOFIA stage requires a complete redefinition of value. It requires you to detach your worth from utility, to recognize that you are not valuable because of what you provide. You are valuable because of what you are. And that's a difficult shift because it removes the external feedback loop that you've relied on for so long. It forces you to generate your own sense of worth without constant confirmation from others. And in the absence of that confirmation, there is often a period of uncertainty, a kind of internal silence. No one is asking for your help. No one is pulling you into their emotional world. No one is reinforcing the identity you've built. And in that silence, a question emerges: if I'm not needed, who am I? That question is not a problem, it's a doorway. But most empaths don't walk through it. They rush to fill the silence. They find another situation, another person, another dynamic that restores the feeling of being needed because that feeling is familiar. It's validating. It gives them a sense of direction, but it also keeps them in the same cycle. The empath who reaches the SOFIA stage does something different. They tolerate the silence. They resist the urge to immediately reattach to a role. They allow the discomfort of not being needed to exist without trying to solve it. And in doing so, they begin to separate their identity from their function. This is where real transformation begins, because once you are no longer driven by the need to be needed, your choices change. You no longer engage out of compulsion. You engage out of alignment. You no longer stay because someone depends on you. You stay because the connection is mutual, balanced, and real. And perhaps most importantly, you gain the ability to walk away. Not out of anger, not out of withdrawal, but out of clarity. You recognize when a dynamic is sustained by your overextension rather than genuine reciprocity. You see when your presence is enabling stagnation rather than supporting growth, and instead of trying to fix it, you step back. That's power. Not the power to control others, but the power to choose yourself without needing justification. And this is where the identity of the empath evolves. From someone who is defined by their usefulness to someone who is grounded in their own existence. From someone who is constantly responding to someone who is intentionally engaging. From someone who is needed to someone who is self-sufficient. And ironically, this is what creates the most authentic form of connection. Because when you no longer need to be needed, your presence is no longer conditional. You're not there to maintain a role or there because you choose to be. And that choice carries a different kind of weight, a different kind of clarity. But reaching that point requires letting go of something that once felt essential. The idea that your worth is something you earn through giving. Because the reality is, as long as you believe that, you will continue to place yourself in situations where you have to prove it. And those situations will keep you exactly where you are. So the shift is simple, but not easy. You stop asking where you are needed, and you start asking where you are aligned. Because one will keep you busy, the other will set you free. If you follow the progression up to this point, then the final barrier becomes almost inevitable. Once an empath begins stepping out of survival mode, establishing boundaries, and detaching from the need to be needed, they begin to break free from the cycle of need and need. They arrive at a place that feels unfamiliar and for many deeply uncomfortable. That place is solitude. Not just physical solitude, but psychological independence. And this is where most people hesitate, because for someone who has spent a lifetime oriented around others, reading them, supporting them, adapting to them, the absence of that constant interaction can feel like a kind of loss. Even if those interactions were draining, they were still familiar. They provided a sense of structure, a sense of identity, a sense of connection. Remove that, and what remains is space. And space, when you're not used to it, can feel like emptiness. So the instinct is to fill it, to re-engage, to reconnect, to re-enter environments that feel known even if they're not aligned, because something in the human mind prefers familiar discomfort over unfamiliar clarity. It's predictable, it's manageable, it doesn't require you to redefine yourself. But the SOFIA stage demands exactly that. It requires the empath to stand alone, not as an act of isolation, but as an act of self-defined to exist without constant external input, to make decisions without needing validation, to experience their own thoughts, their own preferences, their own direction without immediately filtering them through someone else's expectations. And that's not easy because when you remove the noise of constant interaction, you're left with your own internal landscape, your own unresolved questions, your own uncertainties, the things that were easy to overlook when your attention was always focused outward. This is why solitude often feels heavier than it should. It's not just the absence of people, it's the presence of yourself, unfiltered. And for many empaths, that's a new experience. They're used to being defined in relation to others, as the listener, the supporter, the stabilizer. But in solitude, those roles disappear. There's no one to manage, no one to respond to, no one to respond to, no one to adjust for. So the question becomes, who are you without an audience? And again, most don't stay long enough to answer it. They interpret the discomfort as a sign that something is wrong, that they're becoming disconnected or cold or distant. But what's actually happening is that they're encountering a part of growth that cannot be bypassed because independence is not built in connection. It's built in separation. You have to step outside the environment that shaped you in order to see it clearly. You have to create distance from the roles you've been playing in order to understand whether they were ever truly yours. And that distance changes perception. You start to notice patterns that once felt normal. Dynamics that once felt necessary begin to look imbalanced. You see where you were overextending, where you were compensating, where you were quietly compromising parts of yourself to maintain connection. And with that awareness comes a choice. You can return to those environments and continue the pattern now with full awareness, or you can move forward even if it means leaving certain connections behind. This is where the fear of isolation becomes a decisive factor because walking forward often means walking alone, at least for a period of time. It means accepting that not everyone will come with you, that some relationships were built on versions of you that no longer exist, that some people were connected to your availability, not your authenticity. And letting that go can feel like loss, but it's a necessary loss because what you're actually losing is misalignment. You're losing dynamics that required you to shrink, to adjust, to overgive in order to sustain them. And in their place, you're creating the possibility for something different. Connections that are based on clarity, mutual respect, and genuine alignment. But those connections don't appear immediately. There's a gap, a period, where you are no longer who you were, but not yet fully integrated into who you're becoming. And in that gap, solitude becomes your environment, not as punishment, but as preparation. This is where you refine your standards, where you learn to enjoy your own company without needing distraction, where your decisions begin to come from internal alignment rather than external pressure. And slowly, something shifts. Solitude stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like stability. You're no longer searching for connection to define you. You're allowing connection to complement you. You're no longer afraid of being alone because you've built a relationship with yourself that is consistent, reliable, and grounded. And from that place, your tolerance for misaligned environments drops significantly, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. You simply no longer have the capacity or the desire to engage in dynamics that require you to abandon yourself. And that is the threshold, because once you cross it, the fear of isolation loses its influence. You realize that being alone is not the same as being disconnected, that solitude is not emptiness at space, space to think, to choose, to exist without interference. And in that space, you don't just find yourself, you establish yourself. So the final shift is this: you stop fearing the absence of others and you start valuing the presence of yourself. Because at the highest level, the Sophia stage is not about who stays, it's about who you become when you're no longer afraid